The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit another rut in the dusty trail, sending Margaret Sinclair's modest traveling hat askew. She reached up with gloved fingers to straighten it, catching the curious stares of her fellow passengers through the dust-caked window. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly before them, a canvas of amber grass and distant red rock formations that seemed to touch the cloudless sky. "First time out west, miss?" asked the portly merchant seated across from her, mopping his brow with a yellowed handkerchief. Margaret nodded, keeping her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yes, sir, though I suspect it won't be my last." The merchant chuckled nervously. "Bold words for a city lady. Most don't last a season out here. Too rough, too lonely, too—" He gestured vaguely at the wilderness beyond. "Too real," Margaret finished quietly, more to herself than to him. As the coach rounded a bend, the small town of Cedar Ridge came into view, a collection of weather-beaten buildings huddled against the immensity of the plains. The main street was little more than packed earth, flanked by a general store, saloon, hotel, and various establishments that seemed to lean against each other for support against the relentless wind. The driver's shout announced their arrival, and Margaret gathered her single carpet bag, the weight of it familiar in her hands. Everything she owned in the world was in that bag: a few dresses, her mother's silver brush, and a letter that had brought her 2,000 miles from Boston's cobblestone streets to this frontier outpost. As she stepped down from the coach, her city boots sank slightly into the dust. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and somewhere a dog barked. Men in worn denim and leather paused their conversations to watch her descent. Women in calico dresses whispered behind their hands. "Well, I'll be," muttered Jake Morrison from his position outside the saloon. "Another eastern flower come to wilt in our desert." His companion, Samuel Holt, didn't respond. The tall rancher's gray eyes tracked the newcomer's movement with an intensity that surprised even him. Something about the way she held herself straight-backed despite obvious fatigue, chin lifted despite the scrutiny, stirred a memory of his late wife's quiet strength. Margaret made her way to the hotel, aware of every eye upon her. The clerk, a thin man with pomaded hair, looked up from his ledger with barely concealed interest. "Good afternoon. I'd like a room, please," she said, setting her bag down. "Certainly. Miss, how long will you be staying?" "Indefinitely." The word hung in the air like gun smoke. The clerk's eyebrows rose, and Margaret heard the whispers behind her grow louder. "I see. Well, we have a nice room on the second floor. $1 a day, meals included." As Margaret signed the register, the clerk leaned forward conspiratorially. "Pardon my asking, Miss, but do you have family here? A position waiting?" "No," Margaret replied simply, counting out payment for a week in advance. The clerk's eyes widened. A young woman, alone, with no connections or employment, choosing to stay in Cedar Ridge. It was scandalous. It was suspicious. It was the kind of news that would spread through town faster than wildfire. By the time Margaret had climbed the stairs to her room, half the town knew of her arrival. By supper, wild speculation ran rampant. She was a widow, some said a runaway bride, claimed others. A few suggested darker possibilities, a saloon girl fleeing trouble, or worse. Samuel Holt listened to the gossip swirling through Murphy's saloon that evening. His glass of whiskey untouched, he'd come to town for supplies, planning to head back to his ranch before dark. But something made him linger. "I heard she's got money," Jake Morrison was saying to a group of cowhands. "Paid a whole week up front, cash on the barrel." "Money don't mean respectability," countered another man. "Could be she earned it in ways that make a decent woman blush." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd seen judgment rendered too quickly in these parts, seen lives destroyed by assumption and gossip. His own life had taught him the danger of rushing to conclusions. The saloon doors swung open, and conversation stopped. Margaret Sinclair stood in the doorway, her traveling dress exchanged for a simple blue calico that somehow made her look both more approachable and more out of place. Every man in the room stared. "Excuse me," she said, her Boston accent clear and refined. "I'm looking for Mr. Wallace. I was told he sometimes takes his evening meal here." The bartender, a gruff man named O'Brien, pointed to a corner table where the town's only lawyer sat nursing a beer. "That be him, miss, though this ain't exactly a proper place for a lady." "I appreciate your concern," Margaret replied with a slight smile. "But I've found that propriety is often a luxury one can't afford when necessity calls." She made her way to Wallace's table, her boots clicking on the rough floorboards. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stood as she approached. "Mr. Wallace, I'm Margaret Sinclair. I wrote to you about the teaching position." Wallace's face fell. "Miss Sinclair, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. The town council hasn't approved funding for a school teacher. I thought my letter explaining the situation would reach you before—" "It didn't," Margaret said quietly, sinking into the offered chair. The weight of her journey, her hope, seemed to settle on her shoulders all at once. The saloon had gone silent, everyone straining to hear. A woman who'd traveled across the country for a job that didn't exist. It was the kind of story that would be told and retold, growing more dramatic with each telling. "I'm truly sorry," Wallace continued. "If I'd known you were already en route—" Margaret straightened her spine, that same quiet strength Samuel had noticed earlier reasserting itself. "What's done is done. Mr. Wallace, perhaps you could tell me what other employment might be available in Cedar Ridge." Wallace shifted uncomfortably. "For a lady of obvious education and refinement, I'm afraid the options are limited. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house might need help, or perhaps the general store." "She could work here," called out Jake Morrison. His comment followed by coarse laughter. "We could use some prettying up around the place." Margaret turned to face him, her green eyes steady. "I'm sure you could, sir. However, I suspect what this establishment needs more than decoration is a thorough cleaning, starting with its patrons' manners." The laughter died. Jake's face flushed red, and his hand moved toward his holster. Samuel Holt stood up, the scrape of his chair loud in the tense silence. "The lady's right," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man not to be trifled with. "Any man who can't speak respectfully to a woman, regardless of her circumstances, might want to reconsider his presence here." Jake's hand fell away from his gun. Everyone knew Samuel Holt's reputation, fair but formidable. A man who'd carved a successful ranch out of hostile land and held it against all comers. Margaret looked at her unexpected defender, taking in the weathered face, the premature gray in his dark hair, the way he held himself like a man accustomed to bearing heavy loads. "Thank you, Mr. Holt, Samuel Holt." He touched the brim of his hat. "If you're truly looking for work, Miss Sinclair, I might have a proposition." The crowd leaned in eagerly, sensing fresh gossip. "I run the Double H Ranch, about 5 miles north of town. My housekeeper left last month to tend to her sick sister. The position includes room and board, and the pay's fair." Margaret studied him carefully. "And your wife doesn't mind a stranger in her home?" A shadow crossed Samuel's face. "I'm widowed, ma'am, 3 years now. There's just me, my foreman Luis, and a handful of ranch hands who take their meals at the bunkhouse. You'd have your own quarters, proper and private." The offer hung between them like a lifeline. Margaret could feel the town's collective breath held, waiting for her response. A single woman accepting a position in a single man's home, it violated every rule of propriety she'd been raised with. But then again, she'd left propriety behind in a Boston drawing room, along with everything else her former life had held. "When would you need me to start?" she asked. If Samuel was surprised by her quick acceptance, he didn't show it. "Tomorrow. If that suits, I'll send Luis with the wagon after breakfast." Margaret stood, extending her gloved hand. "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Holt." He shook her hand, his calloused palm gentle against her smaller one. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge, Miss Sinclair." As Margaret left the saloon, head high despite the whispers following her, Samuel caught Wallace's eye. The lawyer shrugged as if to say, "You know what you're getting into." But Samuel wasn't sure he did. Something about Margaret Sinclair, the steel beneath the silk, the shadows in her eyes that spoke of secrets and sorrow, told him that hiring her would change things. Whether for better or worse remained to be seen. Outside, Margaret paused on the wooden sidewalk, looking up at the vast western sky ablaze with sunset colors. The town might judge her, might whisper and speculate, but she'd made her choice. Traded the suffocating safety of her old life for the uncertain freedom of this new one. Tomorrow, she'd begin again at the Double H Ranch, where the past couldn't follow and the future waited, as vast and unknown as the prairie itself. The acrid smell of smoke pulled Samuel from his ledgers just past midnight, through his study window. An orange glow flickered against the barn's weathered boards. He grabbed his rifle and burst through the front door, shouting to rouse the bunkhouse. "Fire, all hands to the barn." But as he rounded the corner, Samuel realized the flames weren't consuming his buildings. They formed a deliberate pattern, a burning cross planted in his south pasture. Riders circled it, their faces hidden by bandanas, whooping and firing shots into the air. "Halt!" one called out, his voice muffled but familiar. "This is your first and only warning. That railroad needs to go through, and your land's standing in the way of progress." Samuel raised his rifle, but the riders were already spurring their horses toward the darkness. By the time Luis and the ranch hands arrived, weapons drawn, only the burning cross remained, its flames casting dancing shadows across the grassland. "Should we go after them, boss?" Luis asked, his weathered face grim. "No point. They'll be scattered to the wind by now." Samuel watched the fire consume itself. "But post extra guards. This won't be their last visit." The next morning, Margaret found the household in turmoil. She'd been at the Double H for nearly a week now, settling into a routine of cooking, cleaning, and avoiding the curious stares of the ranch hands. But today, tension crackled through the air like lightning before a storm. "What happened?" she asked Luis as he gulped down coffee in the kitchen. "Night riders," he said simply. "They want Mr. Samuel to sell to the railroad company. He won't budge." Margaret poured herself a cup, her hands steady despite the news. "And if he continues to refuse?" Luis's expression darkened. "Then things get ugly. Señorita, these men, they don't take no for an answer." As if summoned by the conversation, Samuel entered, his face haggard from lack of sleep. He paused when he saw Margaret, something flickering in his gray eyes, concern, perhaps, or regret. "Miss Sinclair, given last night's events, I'd understand if you wanted to return to town. This situation might become complicated." Margaret set down her cup with a decisive click. "Mr. Holt, I've traveled 2,000 miles to escape complications. A few night riders don't frighten me." She paused, then added quietly, "Unless you'd prefer I leave." "No," he said quickly, then seemed surprised by his own vehemence. "That is, you're welcome to stay as long as you feel safe." Their eyes met across the kitchen, and something unspoken passed between them. Luis cleared his throat and excused himself, muttering about checking the fences. That evening, Margaret served supper in the dining room as usual. Samuel typically ate in silence, but tonight he seemed restless, pushing food around his plate. "You're not from money," he said suddenly. Margaret paused in clearing the dishes. "I beg your pardon." "Your hands. The way you work. You weren't raised to be served, despite your educated speech." It wasn't an accusation, merely an observation. She resumed her task, considering her response. "My father was a clockmaker. Respectable but not wealthy. I learned early that honest work brings no shame. And your education? A benefactor who believed in my potential. Her voice carried a bitter edge. Though I sometimes wonder if ignorance might have been kinder. Samuel leaned back in his chair. Studying her, you speak as someone who's been disillusioned. And you speak as someone who recognizes the sentiment. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Touché, Miss Sinclair. The moment was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Samuel was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the colt at his hip, but the rider who appeared at the door was a town boy, breathless with excitement and fear. Mr. Holt. Sir, there's trouble at Murphy's. That Jake Morrison fellow is calling you out, saying things about your new housekeeper. Samuel's face hardened to granite. What kind of things? The boy flushed, stammering. Just improper things. Sir, said if you won't see reason about the railroad, maybe folks should know what kind of establishment you're running here. Margaret stepped forward. I'll come with you. Absolutely not. Samuel's tone brooked no argument. This is my fight. No, Mr. Holt. They're using my reputation as a weapon against you. That makes it my fight as well. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the demure housekeeper, but the woman who'd faced down a saloon full of men with nothing but words and spine. Can you handle a rifle? He asked. My father thought a woman should know how to defend herself. Samuel moved to a cabinet, withdrawing a Winchester. Then you'll ride with Luis as backup, but you stay with the wagon unless things go badly. 20 minutes later, they rolled into Cedar Ridge, the town ablaze with lamplight and curiosity. Word had spread, and it seemed half the population had gathered outside Murphy's. Jake Morrison stood in the street, whiskey courage evident in his swaying stance. There he is, Jake called out as Samuel dismounted. The high and mighty Samuel Holt, too good to take the railroad's generous offer. Tell me, Holt, what's a man like you need with a fancy piece from back east, unless you're running more than cattle on that ranch? The crowd murmured, some shocked, others eager for bloodshed. Samuel walked forward slowly, deliberately, his spurs ringing against the packed earth. Morrison, you're drunk and stupid, which might save your life tonight. Apologize to Miss Sinclair and crawl back into whatever hole you came from. Jake laughed, an ugly sound. Apologize for speaking the truth. Everyone knows what kind of woman takes a position in a bachelor's home. The words died as Samuel's fist connected with Jake's jaw, sending him sprawling into the dust. Jake scrambled up, rage replacing bravado, and reached for his gun. A rifle shot split the night air. Jake froze, his pistol half drawn, and turned to see Margaret standing in the wagon bed, the Winchester steady in her hands. The shot had taken his hat clean off, leaving it spinning in the dirt. The next one won't miss, she said calmly. Though I should mention, Mr. Morrison, that I was secretary to one of Boston's most respected attorneys before circumstances required my relocation. I have letters of recommendation, bank records, and numerous witnesses to my character. What I don't have is patience for small men with whiskey breath making insinuations they can't substantiate. The crowd had gone silent. Even Jake seemed stunned by the transformation of the quiet housekeeper into this formidable figure. Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Jake and Margaret. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pick up your hat, apologize to the lady, and then you're going to tell whoever's paying you to harass me that it won't work. I'm not selling. Not to the railroad, not to anyone. You can't fight progress. Holt! Jake snarled, but he bent to retrieve his hat. The railroad's coming through whether you like it or not. Maybe, but it won't be through my land. Samuel's voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. Now, apologize. Jake's jaw worked like he was chewing nails. But finally, he looked up at Margaret. I apologize, ma'am. My words were ungentlemanly. Insufficient. Margaret replied coolly, but accepted. As Jake slunk away, the crowd began to disperse, though whispers followed in his wake. Samuel helped Margaret down from the wagon, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary at her waist. "That was a hell of a shot," he said quietly. "My father believed in thorough education," she replied, but her voice trembled slightly now that the danger had passed. Wallace, the lawyer, approached, tipping his hat. "Miss Sinclair, that was impressive, though I fear you've made enemies tonight." "Better to face enemies openly than let them strike from the shadows," she said, as they prepared to leave. Samuel noticed Margaret rubbing her shoulder. "The rifle kicks more than you expected." She smiled ruefully. "I may have exaggerated my expertise slightly. I've fired a rifle exactly 3 times in my life, all at tin cans in my father's yard." Samuel stared at her, then surprised them both by laughing a rich, genuine sound that seemed to wash years from his weathered features. "You bluffed Jake Morrison with 3 practice shots. Sometimes confidence matters more than skill, Mr. Holt." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each lost in thought. The confrontation had shifted something between them, torn down walls neither had realized they'd built. As they neared the Double H, Samuel spoke. "What circumstances?" Margaret didn't pretend to misunderstand. "The benefactor I mentioned, he had expectations I couldn't fulfill. When I refused, he ensured I'd find no employment in Boston or anywhere his influence reached." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "He hurt you?" "Not in the way you mean, but there are many ways to wound someone. Destroying their reputation, their future. Sometimes that's worse than physical harm." They reached the ranch house, and Samuel helped her down. In the moonlight, her face was pale but resolute. "I don't need protecting, Mr. Holt. I've learned to fight my own battles." "I know," he said softly. "That's what worries me." As Margaret entered the house, Samuel remained outside, staring at the stars. The night riders would return, he was certain of that. The railroad company wouldn't give up easily. But now they'd involved Margaret, made her a target in their campaign against him. He thought of his wife, Sarah, how he'd failed to protect her from the fever that had claimed her life. He'd sworn never to let anyone close enough to risk that kind of loss again. Yet here was Margaret Sinclair, with her steady hands and sharp wit, already past his defenses. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Samuel shivered despite the warm night. Storms coming? He thought, and this time, he wasn't sure any of them would emerge unscathed. The morning after the confrontation in town, Margaret found herself truly seeing the Double H Ranch for the first time. She'd been there 2 weeks now, but survival had occupied her thoughts more than scenery. As she stood on the porch with her coffee, watching the sun paint the grasslands gold, she understood why Samuel fought so hard to keep this land. The ranch sprawled across a valley between 2 ridges, with a creek winding through like a silver ribbon. Cattle dotted the landscape, and in the distance, a herd of wild mustangs grazed, their presence both beautiful and symbolic of the untamed nature of this place. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Samuel's voice came from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach, a testament to how naturally he moved through this environment. "I've never seen anything like it. In Boston, nature is confined to parks, trimmed and controlled. This land doesn't suffer control gladly," he said, joining her at the railing. "It takes a certain kind of person to make peace with it instead of trying to dominate it. Is that what you've done, made peace with it?" He was quiet for a moment. "My wife used to say I was more married to this ranch than to her." She wasn't entirely wrong. It was the first time he'd voluntarily mentioned his wife. Margaret sensed the weight of the admission. "Luis asked if I could help with the horses today," she said, changing the subject with gentle tact. "He says the new mare is skittish around men." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You know horses." I know how to be quiet and patient. Sometimes that's enough." An hour later, Margaret stood outside the corral where a beautiful bay mare paced nervously. The horse had been purchased from a traveling trader, but something in her past had left her fearful and aggressive. "Careful, señorita," Luis warned. "She already put 2 men over the fence this week." Margaret entered the corral slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. The mare's ears flicked back, her muscles tensing, but instead of approaching, Margaret simply sat down in the dust, her back against the fence, and waited. Samuel watched from his study window, abandoning his ledgers. He'd seen experienced horsemen work with difficult animals, but Margaret's approach was different. She simply existed in the space, occasionally humming softly, making no demands. After an hour, the mare's curiosity overcame her fear. She approached cautiously, nostrils flaring. Margaret didn't move, didn't reach out. The horse drew closer, finally dropping her head to sniff at Margaret's hair. "That's it," Margaret whispered. "Just 2 souls figuring each other out." By the 3rd hour, the mare was eating grain from Margaret's hand. By afternoon, she allowed Margaret to stroke her neck. Luis shook his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like it, boss," he told Samuel. "That woman has a gift." Samuel found Margaret in the stable that evening, brushing the mare's coat. The horse stood placidly, occasionally nuzzling Margaret's shoulder. "You've named her, haven't you?" he asked, noting the affection in Margaret's movements. "Liberty," she admitted with a slight blush. It seemed fitting for a creature that just needed someone to understand her desire for freedom, not control. "Liberty," Samuel repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, that fits both of you." Their eyes met over the horse's back, and Margaret felt that increasingly familiar flutter in her chest. Working at the Double H had awakened something in her she'd thought city life had permanently suppressed, a wildness that matched the land itself. "Would you teach me?" she asked impulsively. "Really teach me? I mean, not just to sit properly on a horse, but to ride like you do, like I belong here." Samuel came around Liberty's side, his expression serious. "It's not easy. The sun, the wind, the work, it changes a person." "I want to be changed," Margaret said firmly. "I came west to leave my old self behind, help me become who I'm meant to be." The next weeks fell into a new rhythm. Mornings were spent on ranch work, Margaret learning to rope, to read weather signs, to understand cattle behavior. Afternoons found her in the saddle, Samuel teaching her to move with the horse rather than merely sitting atop it. "Feel the rhythm," he instructed, his hand briefly touching her knee to adjust her position. "You're fighting her movement. Relax. Trust." The contact, innocent as it was, sent warmth through Margaret that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She forced herself to focus, to sink into Liberty's gait until horse and rider moved as one. "Better," Samuel approved, but his voice sounded strained. They were both fighting at this growing connection that went beyond employer and employee, beyond teacher and student. The very air between them seemed charged during their rides, heavy with unspoken words. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled across the valley with stunning violence. Margaret stood on the porch, mesmerized by nature's display. When Samuel joined her, "First prairie storm?" he asked. "First time I haven't watched one from behind windows," she corrected. "It's terrifying and beautiful at once," he finished. She looked at him, rain mist dampening her face. "Yes, exactly." Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the landscape in stark relief. In that moment, Samuel saw her not as his housekeeper or even as the woman learning to work his ranch, but as someone who understood the wild beauty of this life he'd chosen. "Margaret," he began, then stopped. Her name on his lips felt too intimate, too revealing. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too." Thunder crashed, drowning out whatever might have been said next. But their hands found each other on the porch railing, fingers intertwining with a certainty that words couldn't have matched. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and charged with possibility. They remained on the porch, hands linked, watching stars emerge between racing clouds. "The railroad men will come back," Samuel said eventually. "This fight isn't over." "Then we'll face them together," Margaret replied. "I'm not running anymore, Samuel, from them or from this." He squeezed her hand, a lifetime of loneliness cracking like river ice in spring. "I lost Sarah to this land. The fever took her. But it was the isolation, the hardship that weakened her first. I swore I'd never—" "I'm not Sarah," Margaret interrupted gently. "And you're not the same man you were then. We're both different, both changed by our losses. Maybe that's what makes this possible." Samuel turned to face her fully, his free hand rising to cup her cheek. "You shine in the lamplight," he murmured, "like you belonged in those eastern parlors, not out here in the dust and wind." Margaret leaned into his touch, her own hand covering his. "My heart belongs on your ranch, Samuel. I knew it the moment I saw liberty run free across your pasture. This is where I'm meant to be." The kiss was inevitable as the storms that swept the prairie, natural, powerful, and transformative. When they parted, both were breathless. "The hands will talk," Samuel warned, though he didn't step away. "Let them," Margaret said. "I've faced worse gossip for lesser reasons." From the bunkhouse, Luis watched the two figures on the porch and smiled. About time. He thought the Double H had been too long without a woman's warmth, and Samuel too long without someone who could match his strength. But Luis also worried. The railroad company wouldn't give up. And now they'd have new ammunition, the boss gone soft over a woman. He'd seen what desperate men did when money and progress were at stake. Still, watching Samuel laugh at something Margaret said, a real laugh, not the bitter chuckle he'd perfected since Sarah's death, Luis decided it was worth the risk. Some things were worth fighting for. And if trouble came, well, the Double H would meet it head on. The night deepened, and finally Samuel and Margaret parted. She to her quarters, he to his. But both knew something fundamental had shifted. The ranch that had been Samuel's solitary kingdom now felt like a shared dream, a future worth defending. In her room, Margaret unpinned her hair and thought of liberty, of the mare's journey from fear to trust. Perhaps that's what love was in this harsh land, not the civilized courtship of her Boston days, but something wilder, truer, something that, like the prairie storms, could destroy or renew depending on how you met it. She'd chosen to meet it with open arms, and tomorrow she'd continue learning to be the woman this life required, not despite the hardships, but because of them. For in challenging her, the West had revealed who she truly was, not a clockmaker's daughter playing at being a lady, but a woman strong enough to stand beside a man like Samuel Holt and help him hold the line against whatever came. The coyotes sang in the distance, and Margaret smiled. Let them howl. She was home. The harvest dance arrived with the first cool breath of autumn, transforming Cedar Ridge from a dusty frontier town into something almost magical. Chinese lanterns swayed from ropes stretched across Main Street, and the sound of fiddles tuning drifted from the town hall. It was the one night each year when ranchers, townspeople, and even the traveling merchants pretended they were part of something grander than survival on the prairie. Margaret stood before the mirror in her room at the Double H, wearing the one fine dress she'd kept from Boston, deep emerald silk that caught the lamplight like prairie grass after rain. Her hands trembled as she pinned up her hair. 3 months had passed since that night on the porch. 3 months of stolen glances, brush of fingers, and carefully maintained propriety around the ranch hands. "You clean up nice, señorita," Luis called from the hallway. "The boss. He's pacing like a Mustang in a corral." She found Samuel in the parlor, transformed from ranch owner to gentleman in a black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. He turned at her entrance, and the look in his gray eyes made her breath catch. Margaret. Just her name, but weighted with everything they hadn't allowed themselves to say these past months. "Shall we?" She managed to keep her voice steady, though her pulse raced. The ride to town passed in charged silence. Samuel handled the wagon reins with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, but Margaret noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed periodically. "Nervous, Mr. Holt?" she asked, allowing a teasing note into her voice. "Should I be Miss Sinclair?" "Well, you'll be appearing in public with your scandalous housekeeper. The gossips will feast for weeks." He pulled the wagon to a stop just outside the glow of the town lights, turning to face her fully. "Let them talk. I'm proud to escort you tonight, Ed. Margaret, proud of who you are, who you've become." The town hall blazed with light and music. They entered together, Samuel's hand properly supporting her elbow. But even that simple touch sent warmth through Margaret's arm. The crowd parted, conversation stuttering to a halt before resuming with increased fervor. "Chin up," Samuel murmured. "You've faced down worse than small-town busybodies." Indeed she had. Margaret lifted her head, meeting curious and hostile gazes alike with calm confidence. She'd learned to rope cattle and birth calves. She could certainly handle a dance. The evening progressed better than expected. Several ranchers' wives, impressed by Margaret's transformation from city woman to capable ranch hand, made overtures of friendship. Even Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house, notorious for her rigid propriety, commented favorably on Margaret's appearance. It was during a break in the dancing, while Samuel fetched punch, that trouble arrived. Margaret stood near the open doors, cooling herself in the night air, when a voice from her past froze her blood. Well, Margaret Sinclair, or should I say, the runaway Miss Sinclair. She turned slowly, her worst nightmare confirmed. Richard Blackwood stood before her, immaculate in Eastern tailoring, his smile sharp as a blade. "Mr. Blackwood," she was proud her voice didn't shake. "You're far from Boston. Railroad business brings me to the most rustic locations." His pale eyes traveled over her, possessive and calculating. Imagine my surprise to hear Samuel Holt's mysterious housekeeper described. The Boston accent, the refined manners. I had to see for myself. "What do you want?" She kept her voice low, aware of the curious glances their interaction drew. "What I've always wanted, my dear, you." He stepped closer, and Margaret fought the urge to retreat. "Did you think you could simply disappear, that I wouldn't use every resource at my disposal to find you?" "I think you're a man who can't accept rejection," Margaret replied steadily. "I was clear about my feelings in Boston. Nothing has changed." "Hasn't it?" Richard's smile widened. "You've certainly adapted to frontier life, playing house with that rancher, pretending to be something you're not. But we both know you belong in civilization, not out here in the wilderness." "You're wrong." Samuel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He stood behind Margaret, close enough that she felt the heat of his body, his presence a wall of protection. "Miss Sinclair belongs wherever she chooses." Richard's eyes narrowed as he assessed Samuel. "Ah, the famous Samuel Holt. I've heard so much about you from my associates at the railroad company. Stubborn, they say, unreasonable." "I prefer principled," Samuel replied. "Now, I believe you were just leaving." "Actually, I was hoping to claim a dance with Miss Sinclair, for old time's sake." Richard extended his hand to Margaret, challenge clear in every line of his body. The crowd around them had noticed the confrontation, circles of watchers pretending not to stare. Margaret felt the weight of expectation, the social pressure to accept gracefully, but she also felt Samuel's solid presence behind her, giving her strength. "I'm afraid my dance card is full, Mr. Blackwood," she said clearly. "Every dance is promised to Mr. Holt." Gasps rippled through the nearby crowd. Such a declaration was tantamount to announcing a formal understanding between them. Richard's face darkened. I see. Well then, perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private. You see, I've brought some interesting documents from Boston, character references, shall we say, including some from your former employer regarding certain missing funds. Margaret went rigid. The accusation was false. Richard had fabricated evidence after she'd rejected his advances, but she knew how easily lies became truth in a small town. That's enough. Samuel stepped forward, placing himself partially in front of Margaret. Whatever schemes you're peddling, Blackwood, take them elsewhere. You're not welcome here. I think the good people of Cedar Ridge might feel differently when they learn the truth about their mysterious newcomer. Richard said smoothly. Unless, of course, Miss Sinclair reconsiders my offer. I'm staying at the hotel. You have until tomorrow night to decide. He tipped his hat mockingly and melted back into the crowd, leaving Margaret and Samuel at the center of a ring of whispers. I need air, Margaret managed, turning toward the door. Samuel followed her outside, away from the lights and music, to a quiet spot behind the building. Margaret leaned against the wall, arms wrapped around herself. It's lies, she said before he could speak. All of it. When I refused his proposal, he ensured I'd be ruined in Boston. Forged letters, paid witnesses. No one would hire me. That's why I came west. I know. Samuel's quiet certainty made her look up. I know, because I know you. Margaret, these months, working beside you, watching you, I know exactly who you are. Tears she'd held back for months threatened to spill. He won't stop. Men like Richard Blackwood always get what they want. Not this time. Samuel moved closer, his hands settling gently on her shoulders. You're not alone anymore. The Double H protects its own. Samuel, you don't understand. He has connections, money, influence. And I have something better. His thumb traced her cheekbone, catching a tear that had escaped. I have the truth, and I have you if you'll have me. The music from the dance drifted on the night air, a waltz, sweet and melancholy. Samuel held out his hand. Dance with me, Margaret, right here, right now. Show Blackwood and this whole town that you choose where you belong. She placed her hand in his, and he drew her into his arms. They danced there in the shadows, no audience but the stars, moving together with a grace born of 3 months of partnership. You shine in the city lights, Samuel murmured against her hair. I saw it tonight when you walked in, all that Eastern polish, that sophisticated beauty. Blackwood's right about one thing. You could have that life again. Margaret pulled back enough to meet his eyes. My heart belongs on your ranch, she said firmly. Not because I'm running from Richard Blackwood or Boston or anything else, because I've found something there I never knew I was looking for. Home, purpose, you. Samuel's control finally broke. He pulled her close, kissing her with all the pent-up longing of the past months. Margaret responded with equal fervor, her fingers tangling in his hair, holding him as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. When they parted, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said roughly, not to protect you from Blackwood, not for propriety, because I love you, because the Double H has been waiting for you all along. Samuel! I know it's sudden. I know we should court properly, but... Yes. Margaret silenced him with another kiss, brief but intense. Yes, I'll marry you. Tomorrow if you want. Tonight, even... He laughed, the sound rich with joy and relief. Luis would never forgive us if we didn't let him stand witness. But soon, very soon. They returned to the dance hand in hand, entering together through the main doors. The crowd parted once more, but this time Samuel and Margaret walked through with heads high, claiming their place in the community. Richard Blackwood watched from across the room, his face a mask of cold fury. But Margaret didn't spare him a glance. She had more important things to focus on, like the way Samuel held her as they joined the dancing, the way his eyes promised protection and partnership and a love as vast as the prairie sky. The fiddlers struck up a reel, and Samuel spun her into the music. Around them, Cedar Ridge watched and whispered and gradually accepted what was clear to anyone with the eyes Margaret Sinclair had found where she belonged. And Samuel Holt had found someone worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Richard wouldn't give up easily, and the railroad company still wanted Samuel's land. But tonight, there was music and dancing and the solid warmth of Samuel's hand in hers. "No regrets?" he asked as they paused between song. Margaret looked around the room at Luis grinning from the punch table, at the ranch hands awkwardly attempting to dance, at the life she'd built from the ashes of her old one. "None," she said firmly. "Let tomorrow come. We'll meet it together." And they danced on, two souls who'd found each other across miles and heartbreak, ready to defend their happiness against whatever storms might come. The morning after the dance dawned gray and ominous, matching the dread that settled in Margaret's stomach. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with the implications of Richard Blackwood's presence in Cedar Ridge. As she prepared breakfast, her hands moved automatically through familiar tasks while her thoughts churned. Samuel entered the kitchen earlier than usual, his expression grim. "Riders coming," he said simply. Louis spotted them from the North Ridge. Through the window, Margaret could see the dust cloud approaching too many horses to be friendly visitors. She dried her hands on her apron, squaring her shoulders. "How many?" "8, maybe 10. Samuel checked his Colt, the gesture automatic. "Stay inside. Margaret, whatever happens, we face it together," she interrupted. "You said I was one of the Double H now. That means I stand with you." Before he could argue, the riders thundered into the yard. Richard Blackwood led them, flanked by hired guns whose hard faces spoke of violence barely leashed. But it was the man beside Richard who made Samuel's jaw clench, Judge Cornelius Harper. The railroads bought and paid for legal authority. "Morning, Holt," the judge called out, not bothering to dismount. "I'm here on official business. It seems there are questions about the legal status of one of your employees." Margaret stepped onto the porch, chin raised. "If you have business with me, Judge Harper, perhaps you should address me directly." Richard's smile was triumphant. "Margaret, darling, I tried to handle this quietly last night, but you forced my hand. Judge Harper has some very interesting documents from Boston." The judge produced a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. "Miss Sinclair, you stand accused of embezzlement from the firm of Whitmore and Associates. There's a warrant for your arrest." "Those charges are fabricated," Margaret said steadily, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Mr. Blackwood manufactured evidence after I refused his advances. Any honest investigation would prove—" "Investigations take time," Richard interrupted smoothly. "Months, perhaps years, during which you'd be held in custody, unless, of course, someone were to vouch for your character, sponsor you, so to speak." Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Margaret and the riders. "What's your game?" "Blackwood." "Simple. Miss Sinclair returns to Boston under my protection. In exchange, I'll ensure the charges are dropped. She'll have her reputation restored, her position in society guaranteed." Richard's eyes glittered. "All she has to do is accept my proposal of marriage." "Or," Judge Harper added, "there's another option. Mr. Holt, the railroad company is prepared to make a very generous offer for your land. Sign over the deed, and I might discover these documents are forgeries after all." The trap was elegantly sprung: Margaret's freedom for Samuel's land, or her imprisonment for his principles. Either way, Richard and the railroad won. "You bastard," Samuel growled, his hand hovering near his gun. "Careful," "Halt!" one of the hired guns warned. "We're here all legal-like. You draw on a judge, and we'll cut you down where you stand." Margaret felt the world spinning, saw the impossible choice laid before them. Samuel would never sacrifice his land, the legacy he'd built. But neither would he let her be taken. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. The way his weight shifted, he was preparing to fight, even knowing it meant death. "I'll go." The words fell into the tense silence like stones into water. Samuel whirled to face her, betrayal and anguish warring in his eyes. "Margaret, no." "It's the only way," she said quietly, hating herself for the pain she was causing him. "I won't have bloodshed on my conscience. I won't watch you die for my mistakes." "How touching," Richard drawled. "The lady has a sense. Come along, Margaret. We have a train to catch." But as Margaret stepped forward, something shifted in the morning air. The thunder of hooves announced new arrivals, and suddenly the yard was full of riders, but these wore the weathered faces of neighboring ranchers. "Morning, Sam," called out Tom Morrison, Jake's older brother, but a man of entirely different character. "Heard you might be having some trouble with unwelcome visitors." Behind him rode the Johnsons, the widow Martinez and her sons, even cranky old Peterson from the furthest homestead. In total, 20 riders faced down Richard's 10. Their message clear, the Double H didn't stand alone. Judge Harper's face flushed red. "This is legal business interfering with a lawful arrest." "Is it lawful, though?" A new voice joined the confrontation. Wallace, the lawyer, climbed down from his buggy, briefcase in hand. "Because I've been doing some telegraphing since last night. Interesting things I've learned about you, Mr. Blackwood." Richard's confident smile faltered. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do." Wallace opened his case, producing his own documents. "For instance, the fact that you're no longer employed by Whitmore and Associates. Haven't been for 2 months. In fact, something about misappropriation of client funds." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Margaret stared at Wallace, hope blooming in her chest. "Furthermore," Wallace continued, "I have here sworn affidavits from 3 former employees of the firm, stating that you attempted to coerce them into fabricating evidence against Miss Sinclair. One young lady was particularly descriptive about your methods of persuasion." "Lies," Richard snarled, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "Perhaps, but I also have a telegram from Mr. Whitmore himself, expressing his regret at Miss Sinclair's departure and confirming that their books were thoroughly audited after she left. No discrepancies were found." Wallace smiled thinly. He also mentioned he'd be very interested to learn your current whereabouts. "Mr. Blackwood, something about a pending warrant." The hired guns exchanged glances, the kind of look men share when they realize they've backed the wrong horse. Judge Harper cleared his throat nervously. "Well, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Samuel said coldly, "is you thinking you could come onto my land and threaten what's mine. Margaret Sinclair is under my protection, soon to be my wife. Any man who tries to take her will answer to me. And apparently," he gestured to the assembled ranchers, "to them as well." Tom Morrison spit tobacco juice near the judge's horse, making it dance nervously. "Funny thing about us frontier folk, Judge, we might squabble amongst ourselves, but when outsiders try to push one of us around, we tend to take it personal." Richard's face had gone from red to white. "This isn't over, Margaret. You can't hide behind these provincials forever." "I'm not hiding." Margaret stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. I choose this life, these people, this man. And if you ever come near me or mine again, Mr. Blackwood, you'll discover just how much the frontier has changed me. I'm not the frightened girl who fled Boston. Test me, and you'll regret it." The standoff stretched another moment before Richard yanked his horse's head around. "Judge, we're leaving." "But the railroad," Harper protested. We'll have to find another route, Samuel finished. My land stays in my hands, and if they send more men to change my mind, they'll find the same welcome. The riders retreated, Richard's venomous glare the last thing Margaret saw before dust obscured them. As soon as they were gone, her knees buckled. Samuel caught her, pulling her against his chest. "You were going to sacrifice yourself," he said roughly. "Don't ever do that again." "You were going to get yourself killed," she countered. "Don't you do that again either." Wallace approached, smiling wryly. "Quite a morning. I should mention, Miss Sinclair, that telegram from Whitmore entirely genuine. He asked me to convey his regards and to say that if you ever return to Boston, you'd have a position waiting." Margaret looked around the yard at the neighboring ranchers who'd risked themselves for her. At Luis, grinning from the porch. At Samuel's fierce, protective embrace. "Thank him for me," she said, "but I found my place." The ranchers dispersed with promises to spread the word anyone who troubled the Double H would face unified resistance. Tom Morrison paused before leaving. "My brother Jake's an idiot," he told Samuel. "But I'm not. You've got good people here. We'll stand by you." As the yard emptied, Samuel turned to Margaret. "Wallace, how much of that was true about Blackwood?" The lawyer grinned. "Every word. I spent half the night at the telegraph office. Blackwood's a wanted man back east. I imagine Judge Harper will distance himself quickly once he verifies it." "But how did you know to investigate?" Margaret asked. "Luis found me after the dance. Said you might need legal help. I've learned to trust that man's instincts." After Wallace left, Samuel and Margaret stood alone in the morning sun. The crisis had passed, but its echoes remained. "I meant what I said," Margaret told him. "About marrying you. Not because of Richard or the railroad, but because—" Samuel silenced her with a kiss, deep and claiming. When they parted, his eyes held a mixture of love and determination that took her breath away. "Saturday," he said. "This Saturday, in the church, with the whole town watching. Let them all see that you're mine and I'm yours. No more shadows from the past." "Saturday," she agreed, then smiled. "Though I should warn you, I have nothing appropriate to wear for a wedding." "Luis mentioned the seamstress in town owes him a favor," Samuel said. "Something about her son and a horse trade. I'm sure arrangements can be made." From the house, Luis's voice called out, "Boss, senorita breakfast is getting cold, and we have a ranch to run." They walked back hand in hand, the morning's danger already transforming into another story of frontier justice. But Margaret knew the real victory wasn't in facing down Richard Blackwood. It was in the community that had rallied to protect them, the bonds forged in hardship and trust. The Double H had truly become home, and she'd proven herself worthy of it. Whatever came next, she'd meet it as Margaret Holt, rancher's wife, woman of the West. The city lights of her past held no more allure than distant stars beautiful, perhaps, but cold and unreachable. Here in the dust and wind, under the vast sky, she'd found something worth fighting for, and fight she would, alongside the man who'd shown her that sometimes the greatest courage is in choosing where you belong. The storm struck 3 days before the wedding, as if nature itself had chosen to test their resolve one final time. Margaret woke to the sound of Luis pounding on the door, his voice urgent through the wood. "Senorita, the creek's rising fast, boss needs everyone." She dressed quickly in her work clothes, the wedding dress hanging in the corner, a reminder of how close they were to happiness. Outside, the scene was chaos. Rain lashed sideways, driven by winds that bent the cottonwoods nearly double. The usually placid creek had transformed into a raging torrent, threatening the lower pastures where the cattle grazed. Samuel stood knee-deep in the rushing water, working with the hands to drive the herd to higher ground. His hat was gone, hair plastered to his head, but his voice carried clear over the storm. "Martinez, take the left flank, Tom. Get those stragglers moving." Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed a rope from the barn and waded in beside him. Samuel's eyes widened. "Margaret, get back to the house." "Not a chance," she shouted back, already moving toward a calf struggling in the current. "We're partners, remember?" There was no time to argue. The next hours blurred into a nightmare of wind, water, and desperate effort. Margaret lost count of how many times she slipped, how many cattle she helped drive to safety. Her hands bled from the rope, her muscles screamed, but she didn't stop. It was when they thought they had the last of the herd secure that disaster truly struck. A massive, uprooted tree came barreling down the swollen creek, heading straight for where Samuel worked to free a cow tangled in debris. "Samuel!" Margaret's scream was lost in the storm, but her actions weren't. She launched herself forward, slamming into him just as the tree swept past. They went under together, the current pulling them into the maelstrom. Cold water filled Margaret's lungs as she fought to surface. Her hand found Samuel's shirt, and she held on with desperate strength. They broke through, gasping, only to be pulled under again. The world became a confusion of water and darkness, the roar of the flood overwhelming everything. Then strong hands hauled them out, Louise and Tom Morrison, ropes around their waists, dragging them to safety. Margaret collapsed on the muddy bank, coughing water, her whole body shaking. "You crazy woman." Samuel gasped beside her, pulling her against him. "You could have been killed." "So could you," she managed between coughs. "Together, remember, for better or worse." "We're not married yet," he reminded her, but his arms tightened around her. "Details," she whispered, and felt his chest rumble with exhausted laughter. The storm passed as suddenly as it had come, leaving devastation in its wake. As dawn broke, they surveyed the damage. Fences down, the bridge washed out, part of the barn's roof torn away. But the cattle were safe, the main buildings intact, and everyone accounted for. "Could have been worse," Louise said philosophically, wringing out his hat. "Could have lost people instead of just property." But as the day wore on, it became clear they might lose something else. The bridge to town was gone, the roads impassable mud. With the wedding 2 days away, and guests expecting to attend, it seemed fate had one more cruel card to play. Margaret stood at the creek's edge, now returned to its banks but still running high, and felt tears threaten. After everything Richard Blackwood, the railroad. The town's judgment to be defeated by weather seemed unbearably ironic. Samuel found her there as sunset painted the sky crimson. "We'll rebuild the bridge," he said quietly. "Might take a week or two, but—" "I don't want to wait." The words burst out of her. "I'm tired of waiting, Samuel, tired of obstacles and delays and reasons why we can't just be together." He turned her to face him, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Then we won't wait. Margaret Sinclair, here, now, with the sunset as our church and the prairie as our witness. Will you marry me?" "Samuel, we can't just—" "Can't we?" His smile was the one she loved best, equal parts determination and mischief. Louise was ordained by one of those traveling ministries years ago. It's legal. Maybe not fancy, but legal. Hope bloomed in her chest. "But the guests, the dress—" "To hell with all of it," Samuel said firmly. "I almost lost you in that flood today. I'm not spending another night without you being my wife." An hour later, they stood in the main room of the ranch house. Louise, still damp but beaming, held his worn Bible. The ranch hands gathered around. Tom Morrison and a few neighbors who'd come to help with storm damage serving as witnesses. Margaret wore her simple blue dress, her hair loose and still damp from the river. Samuel had changed into clean clothes but hadn't bothered with anything fancy. "Dearly beloved," Louise began, his accent thick with emotion. "We gather here in this home to join these two stubborn people who finally figured out they belonged together." It wasn't the ceremony Margaret had imagined as a girl. No white dress, no church bells, no crowd of well-wishers. But as she looked into Samuel's eyes, saw the love and promise there, she knew it was perfect. "Samuel," Luis continued, "do you take this woman who jumped into a flood to save your thick skull?" "I do," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Forever and always." "Margaret, do you take this man who'd rather fight the whole world than let you go?" "I do," she whispered, then stronger. "I do." "Then by the power given to me and the grace of God, I pronounce you husband and wife. Boss, kiss your bride before she changes her mind." Samuel pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that had the hands whooping and Luis wiping his eyes. When they parted, Margaret was breathless and laughing. "Mrs. Holt," Samuel murmured against her ear. "How does it feel?" "Like coming home," she answered truthfully. The celebration was makeshift but joyous. Someone produced a fiddle, and they danced in the same room where months ago she'd served his solitary dinners. The storm damage was forgotten for a few hours as the Double H celebrated new beginnings. But Richard Blackwood hadn't given up. They discovered this the next morning when riders approached not the hired guns of before, but something worse. A full cavalry unit, led by a captain who bore orders with official seals. "Mr. Holt," the captain said formally. "I'm ordered to commandeer this property for military use. The railroad has been deemed vital to national security, and your land sits on the required route." Margaret felt Samuel go rigid beside her. This was beyond local corruption. This reached into the highest levels of power. "On what authority?" Samuel demanded. "Emergency Powers Act," the captain replied. He looked uncomfortable but resolute. "You have 48 hours to vacate." "Like hell we will." Samuel's hand moved to his gun, but Margaret caught it. "Captain," she said, stepping forward, "might I see those orders?" Something in her tone, educated, Eastern, familiar with authority, made him hand them over. Margaret studied the documents with the eye of someone who'd worked in law offices, who'd seen how powerful men bent rules to their will. "Interesting," she murmured. "These orders are signed by Colonel Blackwood. Any relation to Richard Blackwood?" The captain shifted. "His uncle, ma'am." "I see. And did Colonel Blackwood happen to mention that his nephew is currently wanted for embezzlement? That this entire action might be motivated by personal vendetta rather than national need?" "Ma'am, I follow orders." "As you should," Margaret agreed. "But perhaps you should verify those orders came through proper channels. A telegraph to Washington might clarify whether the Army truly wants to involve itself in what amounts to a civilian land dispute, motivated by a rejected suitor's revenge." The captain looked between them, clearly reassessing. Margaret pressed her advantage. "My husband served honorably in the war, Captain, as did many of these men. Is this how the government repays their service, by stealing their land on the word of a corrupt official?" "Margaret," Samuel warned, but she wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I have connections in Boston who would be very interested to hear about military resources being used for personal vendettas. The press, Captain, can be quite unforgiving when they scent scandal." The captain was young, probably on his first major command. The certainty in Margaret's voice, the implications of what she was suggesting, clearly troubled him. I'll need to verify these orders," he said finally. "We'll make camp outside your property line while I contact my superiors." As the cavalry withdrew, Samuel stared at his new wife with something approaching awe. "You just faced down the U.S. Army." "I faced down bureaucracy," Margaret corrected, much less impressive. "But it bought us time." Time they used wisely. Wallace worked tirelessly, filing injunctions and sending telegraphs. The neighboring ranchers organized, ready to stand with the Double H again. But it was Margaret's letter to Boston to the one man she'd hoped never to contact again that turned the tide. Josiah Whitmore had been her father's friend before he was her employer. She'd never called on that friendship. Too proud to beg. But for Samuel, for their home, She swallowed her pride. His response came by express rider 3 days later. Brief, businesslike, but effective. Federal marshals arrested Colonel Blackwood for corruption. Richard Blackwood was apprehended trying to flee the territory. The cavalry received new orders to withdraw immediately. "It's over," Wallace announced, arriving with the final documentation. "The railroad will have to find another route. Your land is safe." That night, their first as truly free husband and wife, Margaret found Samuel on the porch, staring out at the land they'd fought so hard to keep. "Regrets?" she asked, slipping her arms around his waist from behind. "Never." He turned in her embrace, cupping her face. "You gave up your past for this. Used connections you'd rather have forgotten. I know what that cost you." "It cost me nothing," Margaret said firmly. "My past gave me the tools to protect our future. That makes every moment of it worthwhile." They stood together as the stars emerged, the ranch spreading peaceful around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, repairs from the storm, rebuilding after the battles, the daily work of survival on the frontier. But tonight, they were simply Samuel and Margaret Holt, two souls who'd found each other across impossible odds. "You never did get your proper wedding," Samuel mused. "White dress, church full of people, all the trimmings." Margaret laughed, the sound carrying across the prairie. "Samuel Holt, I jumped into a flood for you, faced down armies and corrupt judges, and married you in a room full of cowboys while soaking wet. Do you really think I care about a fancy dress?" He kissed her then, long and deep, a promise and a claiming all at once. When they parted, his smile was pure joy. "Have I mentioned today that I love you, Mrs. Holt?" "Not in the last hour," she teased. "You're slipping. Mr. Holt." They went inside together, to the home they'd defended, the life they'd built, the love they'd earned through trial and storm. Outside, the prairie wind sang its eternal song, and the Double H stood firm against the darkness, a beacon of what courage and love could accomplish together. The morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the grasslands like scattered diamonds. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun paint the ranch in shades of gold and amber. 3 weeks had passed since their impromptu wedding, 3 weeks of a peace that felt too fragile to trust. She should have known it wouldn't last. The first sign of trouble came with Luis, his face grave as he entered the kitchen. "Senora, riders approaching from the eastern ridge. Many riders." Samuel was already reaching for his gun belt when they heard it, not the thunder of horses, but the distinctive rattle of wagon wheels. Through the window, Margaret could see them now, 5 wagons, heavily loaded, surrounded by armed outriders. "That's not a war party," Samuel muttered, squinting against the morning sun. "That's a settlement convoy," Margaret finished, her heart sinking. "But why here?" They got their answer when the lead rider dismounted in their yard. Margaret recognized him, Ezra Donnelly, the railroad company's chief surveyor. But it was the woman who climbed down from the first wagon who made her blood run cold. "Samuel Holt," the woman called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Catherine Blackwood. I believe you've met my son and brother-in-law." Catherine Blackwood stood tall and imposing, her silver hair pulled back severely, her black dress impeccable despite the journey. She looked like what she was, Eastern money and Western ambition combined into something formidable. "Mrs. Blackwood," Samuel said carefully, his hand resting on his sidearm. "If you're here to continue your family's harassment—" "On the contrary," Catherine interrupted. "I'm here to clean up the mess my foolish son created. May we speak privately?" Margaret stepped forward, linking her arm through Samuel's. "Whatever you have to say can be said here. This is our land, our home." Catherine's sharp eyes assessed Margaret. "Ah, the new Mrs. Holt, the woman who finally taught Richard that no means no." I suppose I should thank you for that lesson, however painful it was for him to learn. What do you want? Samuel asked bluntly. Direct. I appreciate that in a man. Catherine gestured to the wagons. What I want, Mr. Holt, is to make a different kind of deal, one that benefits everyone. Despite their wariness, Samuel and Margaret agreed to hear her out. In the parlor, Catherine Blackwood laid out her proposal with the efficiency of someone who'd negotiated million-dollar deals over afternoon tea. The railroad will be built, she stated flatly. If not through your land, then around it. But that detour will cost time and money, and will leave this entire region isolated from prosperity. Your principles, while admirable, will ultimately harm your neighbors more than the railroad company. Then let them choose, Samuel began. They have chosen? Catherine interrupted. Those wagons outside, they carry families who've sold their land to the railroad. But here's where it gets interesting. Mr. Holt, they've sold to me, not to the company. Margaret leaned forward. What's the difference? Catherine smiled, and it transformed her stern features. The difference, my dear, is that I have a vision beyond mere profit. My late husband built his fortune on steel and steam, but he never understood that progress without community is just destruction with a prettier name. She produced a map, spreading it on the table. I propose a compromise. The railroad gets a corridor through the southern portion of your land, the section already damaged by floods, less ideal for grazing. In exchange, you receive shares in the railroad company equal to twice the land value, plus guaranteed shipping rates for your cattle that will make you wealthy beyond imagining. And those settlers? Samuel asked suspiciously. We'll establish a town at the junction where your land meets the railroad. A proper town, with schools, churches, businesses. Your ranch remains intact, but your isolation ends. Your future children will have education, culture, opportunity. The mention of children made Margaret's hand move unconsciously to her stomach. She wasn't certain yet, but the signs were there. Samuel noticed the gesture, his eyes widening slightly. And if we refuse? He asked, though his voice had lost its earlier hardness. Then I build around you, Catherine said simply. The town rises anyway, but on less favorable ground. Your neighbors prosper while you cling to your principles and watch opportunity pass by. Eventually, isolation becomes irrelevance. Luis knocked and entered. Senor, some of the settlers are asking if they can water their horses. There are children with them. Senora, they look tired. Margaret rose immediately. Of course, bring them to the well. I'll prepare food. As she moved toward the kitchen, Catherine called after her. You have a kind heart, Mrs. Holt. My son could never see past his own desires to recognize true worth, his loss. Outside, Margaret found not the hardened speculators she'd expected, but families much like she'd once been people seeking new beginnings. A young woman named Alice, traveling with 2 small children after losing her husband to fever. An elderly couple, the Olsons, whose farm in Iowa had been lost to drought. The Changs, a Chinese family facing violence in the California goldfields, seeking safety in anonymity. We heard about you, Alice said shyly as Margaret helped her water the children. How you stood up to those men, how you and Mr. Holt fought for what's yours. We're hoping to build something worth fighting for, too. Margaret looked at the hopeful faces, the worn clothes, the determination despite hardship. She saw herself months ago, stepping off that stagecoach with nothing but hope and a single bag. When she returned to the house, she found Samuel and Catherine still negotiating, but the tone had changed. Maps covered the table, both parties pointing and discussing. The school would go here, Catherine was saying. Close enough to serve your ranch hands' families, far enough to not disturb your operations. And water rights, Samuel pressed. The creek can't support a town and a ranch both. Already considered. We'll dig wells, bring in a proper engineer. The railroad needs water for the steam engines anyway. Margaret caught Samuel's eye, and in that look, a conversation passed. He saw what she'd seen not a threat, but an opportunity. Not the end of their dream, but its evolution. "One condition," Samuel said finally. "The town charter includes provisions for fair treatment of all settlers, no matter their race or religion. I won't have the ugliness we've seen elsewhere take root here." Catherine's eyebrows rose. "Progressive, Mr. Holt. But I agree. Bad for business to exclude potential customers and workers." They shook hands, and Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not the violent upheaval of their previous battles, but the slow, inevitable change of progress, finding compromise with principle. Over the following days, the transformation began. Surveyors marked the railroad corridor. Careful to preserve the best grazing land, the settlers established a temporary camp that would become the seed of the new town. Samuel surprised everyone by working alongside them, his knowledge of the land invaluable in choosing well sites and planning roads. But not everyone was pleased. Jake Morrison, still smarting from his humiliation, gathered a group of malcontents in Murphy's saloon. Holtz sold out. He declared to anyone who'd listen. All that high talk about protecting the land, and he folds the minute someone waves money at him. Word reached the Double H, and Margaret expected Samuel to ignore it. Instead, he surprised her. "Saddle up," he told her one evening. "We're going to town." They rode in together, entering Murphy's to find Jake holding court with a handful of supporters. The room fell silent as they appeared. "Come to gloat. Holt," Jake sneered. "Show off how the railroad bought you." Samuel moved to the bar, ordering 2 whiskeys, one for himself, one which he slid down to Jake. "Come outside, Morrison. Time we settled this properly." The crowd followed eagerly, expecting a fight. Instead, Samuel led them to where the new town was taking shape. Lanterns bobbed in the twilight as families worked together, raising frames for houses, sharing meals around campfires. "You see destruction," Samuel said to Jake in the crowd. "I see neighbors. You see the railroad winning. I see us choosing our future instead of having it forced on us. Every one of those settlers paid fair price for land. Everyone will work to build something lasting." He pointed to where the Changs were teaching the Olsen children to use chopsticks, both families laughing at the attempts. Where Alice was helping other women plan a communal garden. Where men of various backgrounds worked side by side on what would become the schoolhouse. "The West is changing. Jake, we can be bitter about it, or we can help shape it. I choose to shape it." Margaret watched Jake's face as he took in the scene. The anger didn't disappear entirely, but something else crept in: uncertainty, maybe even a touch of longing. "And if it all goes wrong?" Jake asked. His belligerence dimmed. "If the railroad breaks its promises, then we hold them accountable," Samuel said simply. "Together, as a community." It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning. As they rode home, Margaret reached over to take Samuel's hand. "You've changed," she said softly. "The man I met would have fought any compromise." "You changed me," he corrected. "Showed me that strength isn't always about standing alone. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stand together." They reached the ranch as full dark fell, finding Luis on the porch with his guitar, playing softly for some of the settler children who'd wandered over. Their parents sat nearby, sharing coffee and stories with the ranch hands. "Senor, Senora," Luis called out. "Young Tom here was asking about the gunfight last month. I told him the real heroes were the ones who found a way to avoid it." Samuel dismounted and helped Margaret down, his hands lingering on her waist. "Luis is right, Tom. Any fool can pull a trigger. It takes wisdom to build a future." As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself watching the mixed gathering with wonder. This was what they'd fought for. Really not just land or principle, but the right to choose their community, to build something new from the best of what they'd been and what they could become. Catherine Blackwood appeared at her elbow, having stayed to oversee the initial settlement. "No regrets," Mrs. Holt. None, Margaret said firmly. You gave us a choice. That's all we ever wanted. And the future. Catherine gestured to where Samuel was teaching the Chang children to rope, their delighted laughter carrying on the night air. What do you see? Margaret's hand moved again to her stomach, more certain now of the life growing within. I see a place where our children will have both roots and wings, where the values of the frontier meet the opportunities of progress, where people are judged by their character, not their origins. Idealistic, Catherine observed. Necessary, Margaret countered. What's the point of building a future if we don't try to make it better than the past? The older woman smiled, a genuine expression that softened her austere features. You'll do well here. Margaret Holt, you and your husband both. You have the rarest of combinations, strength and wisdom, principle and pragmatism. As Catherine retired to the guest room, Margaret remained on the porch, watching the impromptu gathering continue. Samuel eventually joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Holt. She leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. I'm thinking about beginnings and endings, how sometimes they're the same thing. The end of the Double H as we knew it, and the beginning of something larger, something that honors what you built while embracing what we'll build together. He turned her to face him, and in the lamplight, she could see the mix of emotions in his eyes, loss for the simple life he'd known, excitement for what was to come, and above all, love for the woman who'd helped him find this path. No regrets, he asked, echoing Catherine's question. One, Margaret admitted. I wish we'd met sooner. I wish we'd had more time before everything changed. We have the rest of our lives, Samuel reminded her. And speaking of that, his hand moved to rest on her stomach, questioning. She covered his hand with hers, confirming what he suspected. Come spring, there'll be another Holt on the Double H. His kiss was answer enough. Joy and promise and fierce protection all mixed into one perfect moment. Around them, the ranch began its transformation into something new, not ending, but evolving, like the frontier itself. The coyotes still sang in the distance, but now their song mixed with human voices, with laughter and music and the sound of community being born. It was messier than the solitary beauty Samuel had known, more complex than the simple escape Margaret had sought. It was real and difficult and absolutely perfect. Spring arrived with a vengeance that year, painting the prairie in wildflowers and bringing with it the promise of new life. Margaret stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house, one hand resting on her swollen belly, watching the controlled chaos of progress unfold before her. Where once only cattle had grazed, now a small town was taking shape. Cedar Ridge Junction. They'd decided to call it honoring the past while acknowledging the future. The railroad tracks gleamed in the morning sun, running along the southern border of the Double H exactly as negotiated. Already, the first official train had come through, bringing supplies, settlers, and possibilities. You shouldn't be on your feet so much, Samuel said, appearing with a cup of tea. His protective hovering had intensified as her pregnancy progressed, much to Margaret's amusement and occasional frustration. Doctor, Mills said movement is good for me, she reminded him, accepting the tea gratefully. Besides, I want to see this. This was the raising of the new schoolhouse, a community effort that had brought together every family in the growing settlement. Even Jake Morrison was there, having finally swallowed his pride and accepted work as the railroad depot manager, a position Samuel had quietly recommended him for. I never thought I'd see the day, Luis commented, joining them on the porch. Jake Morrison doing honest work, the Chang family accepted as neighbors, and the Double H hosting a school raising. The world's gone loco, boss. The good kind of crazy, Margaret said softly, as if to emphasize her point. Young Tom Morrison came running up, followed by two of the Chang children and Alice's daughter, Mary. Mrs. Holt, Mrs. Holt, Papa says you know stories about Boston. Will you tell us about the big city? Margaret smiled. Easing herself into the porch chair Samuel quickly provided. What would you like to know? As she regaled the children with tales of gaslit streets and buildings that scraped the sky, she marveled at how distant that life seemed now. The woman who'd fled Boston in desperation felt like a stranger, someone she'd known once but could barely recognize. The schoolhouse walls went up steadily throughout the day, and by afternoon, the basic structure stood ready for roofing. Catherine Blackwood, who'd extended her stay to oversee the town's establishment, approached with a satisfied expression. The teacher arrives next week, she announced. A young woman from Philadelphia, highly recommended, Miss Eleanor Hartley. She'll stay with us until the teacher's residence is complete, Margaret offered immediately. We have the room. Catherine smiled. Still collecting strays. I see. First that mare Liberty, then half the territory's misfits and outcasts. They're not strays, Samuel said firmly, his arm going around Margaret's shoulders. They're neighbors. As evening approached, the working day transformed into celebration. Tables appeared laden with food, a mixture of cuisines that reflected the community's diversity. German sausages sat beside Chinese dumplings, Mexican tamales next to Irish stew. Margaret contributed her Boston brown bread, though she'd adapted the recipe with prairie ingredients. Look at this, Tom Morrison said to his brother Jake, gesturing at the gathered crowd. 6 months ago, half these people would have crossed the street to avoid each other. Now they're sharing recipes. Jake nodded slowly, his usual sneer replaced by something almost resembling contentment. Your Margaret Holt did this, he said to Samuel, who'd overheard. That woman of yours has a way of making folks see past themselves. She does, Samuel agreed simply, his eyes finding his wife where she sat with the other women, discussing plans for a community garden. As night fell, lanterns were lit and music began. Luis brought out his guitar, joined by Mr. Chang's erhu and Patrick O'Brien's fiddle. The unlikely ensemble created a sound unique to this place, neither purely Western nor Eastern, but something entirely new. Margaret found herself pulled into a dance by Samuel, moving carefully due to her condition but unwilling to sit out entirely. Around them, other couples joined in the Olsons with their decades of practiced harmony. Young Alice shyly accepting a dance from Tom Morrison. Even Catherine Blackwood accepting Luis's gallant invitation. You're thinking again, Samuel murmured in her ear. Remembering, she corrected. That first dance in town, when you defended me against Jake, when you said I shone in the city lights. You do, he said, spinning her gently. You shine everywhere, Margaret, but especially here, especially now. The dance ended when Margaret felt the first pain sharp and unexpected. Samuel's face went white as she gripped his arm. It's time, she said, trying to stay calm despite the fear that suddenly gripped her. It was too early. 3 weeks at least. The next hours blurred into a haze of pain and worried voices. Dr. Mills was summoned from town, Catherine Blackwood taking charge with the efficiency that had built a fortune. The women gathered Alice, Mrs. Chang, Mrs. Olson, each offering their own wisdom and comfort. Samuel paced the hallway like a caged mountain cat, Luis trying unsuccessfully to calm him. Senora Margaret is strong, Luis insisted. Stronger than any woman I know. Sarah was strong too, Samuel said roughly, the old fear surfacing. Strength isn't always enough out here. No, Luis agreed. But love helps. And that baby, it's born from love that conquered more trials than most see in a lifetime. That counts for something. Inside the room, Margaret fought her own battle, clinging to Alice's hand as another contraction seized her. The baby knows, she gasped between pains. Knows the schoolhouse is up, the town is started, wants to see it all. Then let's help this impatient child into the world. Doctor, Mills said kindly, Mrs. Blackwood, more hot water. Ladies, we're close now. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge Junction, painting the new buildings in soft gold, a cry pierced the morning air, strong, healthy, and absolutely indignant at the audacity of being born. A girl. Dr. Mills announced, placing the squalling infant in Margaret's exhausted arms. Small but perfect. A fighter, like her mother. Samuel was allowed in then, his face a mix of joy, relief, and complete awe as he saw his daughter for the first time. "She's beautiful," he whispered, one finger gently touching the baby's tiny fist. "What shall we call her?" Margaret looked at their daughter, this perfect blend of east and west, of old dreams and new beginnings. "Hope," she said softly. "Hope, Catherine Holt, for her grandmother who passed and the one who helped us find our way." Catherine Blackwood, still present despite the hour, actually teared up at that. "A fine name," she said gruffly, "though I suspect this young lady will make her own way, regardless of what we call her." As the sun climbed higher, word spread through the settlement. By noon, it seemed everyone had found a reason to stop by the Double H. They came with gifts: a quilt from the sewing circle, a carved rattle from Mr. Chang, a tiny pair of boots from the bootmaker who just opened shop. "First baby born in Cedar Ridge Junction," Tom Morrison declared. "That makes her special." "All babies are special," his brother Jake said, surprising everyone. "But yeah, this one, she's the future. Isn't she born knowing both worlds, belonging to both?" Margaret, propped up in bed with Hope nursing contentedly, looked out the window at the scene below. The ranch she'd first seen as a refuge had become a crossroads. The man she'd served as housekeeper was now her husband and the father of her child. The life she'd thought ended in Boston had led to something richer than she'd ever imagined. "Regrets?" Samuel asked, echoing their old refrain as he sat beside her on the bed. "Never," she said firmly. "Though I do wonder what Hope will think of our story someday. How do we explain all this, the fights, the floods, the way we found each other?" "We tell her the truth," Samuel said simply. "That sometimes you have to lose yourself to find where you belong. That love isn't always easy, but it's always worth fighting for. That the strongest foundations are built on ground that's been tested by storms." Hope finished nursing and yawned, her tiny features relaxing into sleep. Margaret traced her daughter's face gently, seeing Samuel's strong jaw, her own determined chin. This child would grow up bilingual in frontier courage and Eastern refinement, equally at home on horseback or in a library. "The world's changing so fast," Margaret mused. "By the time she's grown, what will this place look like?" Samuel considered this, looking out at the bustling settlement. "Different, certainly, bigger. But if we do our job right, if we raise her right, the heart of it will remain. The values that built the Double H: hard work, fair dealing, judging people by their character, not their origins. Those don't have to change just because the landscape does." A knock at the door interrupted them. Luis peered in, grinning. "Sorry to disturb, but there's someone here to see you both. Says it's important." The visitor turned out to be Wallace, the lawyer, dusty from hard riding but smiling broadly. "Congratulations on the little one," he said, "and I bring more good news. The territorial governor has officially recognized Cedar Ridge Junction as an incorporated town. You'll need to elect a mayor, form a town council." "Let me guess," Samuel said dryly. "You have suggestions." "The townspeople do," Wallace corrected. "They want you, Samuel, both of you, really. They figure anyone who can turn enemies into neighbors and make the railroad company compromise deserves a chance at leadership." Margaret laughed, startling Hope briefly. "From ranch hand to mayor's wife, that's quite a journey." "You've made longer ones," Samuel reminded her. "What do you think?" She looked at their daughter, at the town growing beyond their window, at the man she'd chosen to build a life with. I think Hope deserves to grow up in a place her parents helped shape. Yes, let's do it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of visitors and congratulations. As evening fell, Margaret finally found herself alone with Samuel and Hope in the peaceful nursery they'd prepared. The baby slept in her cradle, a gift from Luis, who'd carved it himself while her parents sat close together in the dying light. "We did it," Margaret said softly. "We really did it. Built a life, a family, a community." "We survived it," Samuel corrected with a wry smile. "The building part seemed to happen on its own once we stopped fighting the current." Outside, the sounds of the growing town mixed with the eternal prairie wind. Somewhere, a hammer rang as someone worked late. Children's laughter echoed from the street. A train whistle sounded in the distance, promising connection to the wider world, while the coyotes reminded them that the wild was never far away. Margaret rose carefully and moved to the window, Samuel joining her. Together they looked out at what they'd helped create, not just the buildings or the railroad, but the spirit of possibility that infected everyone who came here. The Double H Ranch stood at the heart of it all, transformed, but not diminished, its values spreading like seeds on the wind. "My heart belongs on your ranch," Margaret murmured, repeating the words that had changed everything months ago. "Our ranch," Samuel corrected, pulling her close. "Our town, our future." Hope stirred in her cradle, making the soft sounds of baby dreams. Her parents watched her, seeing in that tiny form all the promise of the frontier, the chance to become something new while honoring what came before, to build bridges between worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart. The stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had witnessed their struggles and triumphs, but now they shone on something more than a lonely ranch or a desperate woman's refuge. They shone on a place where the American dream was being rebuilt with every sunrise, where the past and future shook hands over the present's cradle. And in the house on the hill, where once a widower had eaten solitary meals and a runaway had found sanctuary, a family settled in for their first night together. The circle was complete, but the story, like the frontier itself, was just beginning. The West had tested them, broken them down, and rebuilt them stronger. Now it was their turn to shape it in return. One choice, one day, one child at a time. Margaret Holt, once Sinclair, looked at her sleeping daughter and knew that every mile traveled, every tear shed, every battle fought had led to this moment. She was home. Thank you for listening to this story of love, courage, and new beginnings in the American frontier. I hope Margaret and Samuel's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while telling it. I'm curious, where are you listening to this story from? Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what this tale meant to you. If you enjoyed this Western romance, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more stories of the untamed frontier. Don't forget to like this video and hit the hype button to help more people discover this story of how love conquers all, even in the harshest landscapes. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own horizons.